David wasn't a violent man. He was a father, a husband, a successful professional, until a prescription for an antidepressant sent him spiraling into paranoia, delusion, and ultimately an unimaginable tragedy where he ended his son's life. Today, David is here to share his story. He'll take us through the severe side effects that no one warned him about, the chilling moment his mind was hijacked, and the devastating aftermath, how he lost his son and his freedom. But he'll also reveal how he fought back, what he learned, and the warning signs every family needs to know. And it's also a call for truth, informed consent, and the fight to prevent this from ever happening again. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear just might save a life. David, thanks so much for coming on and agreeing to share your story.
Well, it's nice to be here. It's a difficult story to always share, but I do appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, David, why don't you just take us back to the beginning? How did you end up taking psychiatric medications in the first place?
Well, it really goes back to 2001. I was working with a national fitness organization in Canada called Paxil, and my role was director of national projects. I was specifically hired to promote a concept called Sport for All, which is sport for all children and youth to try to use it as a treatment intervention for addictions and other health conditions, which to me is somewhat ironic with what happened to me. But Health Canada came around and they closed our doors in the beginning of 2001 because they were not willing to provide $5 million for us to help prevent a lot of health conditions in the country. Now, at the time, they had a many billion-dollar budget, and a lot of it was transferred to provinces to deal with our medical system, and $5 million to help prevent disease and health conditions. Our president closed the doors. Then a recession came, so I had cash flow worries. You know, Dr. Josef, like many people right now, post-COVID, and now potentially because of a recession in both of our countries, are going to deal with cash flow issues like I did. So I leveraged all my assets just to pay bills. I had a family of 4, 2 young children, a nice home in Toronto, until I couldn't leverage anything else anymore. And I became distressed. And when I was distressed, I went to the doctor. I was told I had a chemical imbalance in my brain, prescribed Paxil to deal with anxiety. And I was on it for 8 months. Almost immediately, I felt akathisia. I felt some agitation, but not that much because I wasn't busy with work. I was able to rest at the same time. So I went through, but I put on quite a bit of weight. Almost immediately, I saw my weight gain. Dealt with sexual dysfunction issues. I was sweating at night. So after 8 months, I read How Do You Get Yourself Off Paxil with a guide that we have in Canada to drugs. And it said, do it slowly. That's the only information that was out there back in 2003, 2004. So I weaned myself off over 5 weeks. I dealt with some withdrawal symptoms. My suicidal thoughts were worse coming off the drug than I was going on the drug. I was very agitated, very abrupt. Even for the 8 months I was on it, my wife and daughter say that I was abrupt. I mean, my case is extreme, but it changes the behavior of a lot of people. You know, the violence is just not physical violence, the abruptness, the shortness. I got into a bit of road rage. I felt like killing somebody. I'm going, this is not me. As I eventually came off and things seemed to settle down. And I had good contract work. I was making good money. But because of my contract work, I was sleep deprived. So after being off it for a few months, I said, look, I'm starting to feel distressed again, which I felt that chemical imbalance is coming back. I put myself back on 40 milligrams of Paxil, which is what I was first prescribed. And this is in beginning of July 2004. And suddenly my akathisia was worse. My suicidal thoughts, I was starting to plan a suicide. I thought, gosh, I got back on the drug just in time. But I also looked into the guide to drugs in Canada and read the maximum recommended dosage at the time. Now it's 40 milligrams, but at the time it was 60 milligrams. I put myself back on it, and I became psychotic. And when you're in that state, you have no idea there's anything wrong with your thinking. And I became calmer. My wife thought I was getting better. And 2 weeks later, I took my son to a hotel. We were going to go to a skate park the next day. And on July 31st at 3 o'clock in the morning, I strangled him and was charged with first-degree murder.
Now, so how much medical oversight was going on? You know, for instance, I mean, you get put back on the drug. I think, did you say 2004? Was that right?
Well, I was on the drug starting in July 2003. And then in February of 2004 is when I weaned myself off. And then went back on the drug. My doctor knew that I weaned myself off, and my doctor knew that I had put myself back on the drug. There was no monitoring. Yeah. There was no medical advice. Never even told me about one side effect. And I just blindly trusted my doctor, which is why now my work right now is about informed consent. You know, and you talk demand informed consent. It's your legal right. And that's really why I'm doing what I'm doing now, because I just blindly trusted my doctor, like most people.
Yeah. What do you remember about that time slipping into the psychosis?
I remember every detail. You know, it was really interesting in my case. I was still psychotic for 2 weeks after I took Ian's life. And he was 11 years old. I was arrested. I very calmly called 911. At the time, my family came to visit me. The former president of Participation, the organization I was talking about, came to visit me. Our lawyer came to visit me. And I was no different than I am with you right now. I thought I had done the right thing for everybody in my mind. When I was arrested, the judge asked me, do I have a lawyer? And I said, no, I don't need a lawyer. I just want to start my 25 years. I felt what I had done was right. Even though I knew it was illegal, I thought it was right. And this is where my lawyer came on board, my defense lawyer, and he said, first thing you have to do is, based on anecdotal evidence, some people who knew me, they thought I was depressed. My doctor diagnosed it as anxiety. And the people say he said, we need to do some tests on you. So he spent, out of the money that was raised for my defense, about $5,000 to hire medical experts to come in and test me. Now, I'm sure a lot of your viewers understand some of these medical tests. Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Hundreds of questions. I completed it in 45 minutes. My IQ was high, probably higher than normal. I was functioning, and they could not tell I was psychotic. I was not hallucinating. I was delusional. They thought that maybe what I did was really, I thought my son had permanent brain damage. He had mild epilepsy. There was nothing wrong with my son.
Yeah, I was wondering tell us more about that. What was in this psychotic delusion that had taken over? How were you able to rationalize it that it was the right thing to do?
Well, it started off with my son who had mild epilepsy, and I interpreted that as permanent brain damage. He was never going to have a future. His life was going to be just awful. So that was the first part of it. He argued with his sister, my daughter, and I thought he was going to kill her. That was one of my delusions. My wife, challenging, like every parent, you know, it's not easy to raise kids. I thought she was going to have a nervous breakdown. And I thought he was going to hurt other children because he was throwing some balls at them in a pool. You know, so you start to put all this together, and it seems you build a plan. And a lot of my previous work was in strategic communication. So you put a strategy together to try to help everybody. And I planned a homicide, and I planned it. You know, it's no different than the Lindsay Clancy case in many ways, except she was on so many different medications. I mean, to me, there's medical malpractice in that case.
For those who may not be aware of that case, could you just describe what you're speaking about?
Well, Lindsay Clancy was a nurse in Massachusetts, you know, in the maternity ward, dealing with deliveries. And her husband says she became anxious about returning to work, so she was prescribed an SSRI. Now, I don't know all the details more than what I've read, and I've talked to a few people. But I think it was Zoloft or Paxil, Prozac, because she was on both. And it told her she was on 5 different medications. And her case is so common from cases I hear about, where if you're having an adverse reaction, they prescribe another drug and another drug. And eventually she was on 13 different drugs, and several drugs when she took the life of her 3 young children, a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and an 8-month-old. And then she jumped out of a second floor window, attempting suicide, and is now a paraplegic. And this is going back to January 2023, and her trial is now just coming up in January of 2026. But her behavior was very similar to mine, and I've written about it in Mad in America on a blog post called SSRIs, Lindsay, Clancy, and Me. And it really gets into the similarities between our cases. She was calm. The day before, she was out with people. The week that I took Ian's life, I had a meeting with researchers from universities talking about developing a strategy around educating parents and coaches about children in sport. I mean, my behavior got back to normal. And I think this is one of the challenges. How do you get into that delusion? How do you know that somebody is delusional? Because in my mind, I was thinking logically. I was going to do everybody a favor. And this, to me, is one of the challenges of identifying this type of psychosis. It's not like schizophrenia. We're not talking. To me, I didn't see or hear anything. But these delusions were very powerful. So there's a lot of similarities with that case. And tragically, this is 20 years after, my homicide. And this shouldn't be happening anymore.
David, can you speak? So apart from this this delusion that you had that, your son, was permanently going to be disabled by the epilepsy, had some brain damage, and that he was going to be aggressive. It seems like this was a really fixed delusion. Can you give us any more insight into the state of mind that you were in? Was it just this one thing, or did you notice anything else about your behavior or how you were looking at the world that could just give more texture to what it's like to be in this type of psychosis?
No, I was fixed on that, and a forensic psychiatrist that assessed me says the way he described psychosis was you take one issue that you might have and you blow it out of proportion 30 times. And that's basically what I did. I mean, I was making $200,000 a year consulting back then. No more cash flow worries. This was about saving my family and putting my son into what I thought was a better place. And as I said, I was still psychotic for 2 weeks afterwards. And people just thought I was back to normal. And then when my psychosis lifted, I was in suicide watch in jail in segregation, and I just cried for 3 days because it did lift like a cloud, and you just can't understand what you did.
What was the month like after you came out of it?
Oh, excruciating is the only way. I mean, I was in protective custody in jail, waiting to get transferred to a mental health center in Ottawa, Ontario, a psychiatric hospital, to be assessed. And I was just trying to put it together and try to figure it out. And as I came out of my psychosis, to try to help deal with it, I sort of fell back, trying to rationalize this to myself again as I'm sort of slowly coming out of psychosis, which I think it's hard for people to understand. You try to, no, I did the right thing, but it doesn't last very long. I knew it was the wrong thing. I knew my family was destroyed. I knew I would never see Ian again. Yeah. So, there's no other word than catastrophic. You just can't hold on to this fixed false belief anymore. And now you're working through the criminal justice system on a charge of first-degree murder where, being prepared to spend 25 years in prison. And, when I was delusional, that didn't bother me. But my goodness, I had a daughter. She answered the door for the Toronto police when she was 14 years old. And if it wasn't for her, I'm not sure I would be alive.
How so?
Well, part of this was when I was in a mental health center. This is all through remand before my trial. I went to what they call a secure treatment unit, which is a prison for people who have been sentenced to 2 years less a day with mental health issues. And I was there for 3.5 months. And I was in my own room for 23 hours a day for 3.5 months with nothing more than a flashing red light. And, with my own experience, And my education is in high performance coaching and sort of trying to deal with negative thoughts. And to replace my negative thoughts, my one line that I probably said millions of times was, I'm a good dad, I'm going to be a dad again. I'm a good dad, I'm going to be a dad again. And it was that kept me going through this very difficult period heading into my trial in September of 2005.
Coming back to that month after you wake up from this psychosis, can you walk me through the process of how you started to understand what had happened? Because I mean, looking back now, we're talking about a drug-induced psychosis. I mean, was that apparent to you at the time? Like, how did you? I could imagine almost feeling in your position, almost like that I had been hijacked by an evil spirit or something like that, like something demonic had almost taken place. I mean, waking up and kind of realizing what had happened, and I'd just be curious, like, how did you put it together? What was that like after that had happened?
Well, it was really interesting, and it's a great question, Dr. Josef. When I was arrested, I waited until 9:00 in the morning to call 911. I didn't want to disturb the other hotel guests. And a woman police officer came up on her own, which surprised me. Here's someone calling about a homicide of their own child, and you got one woman officer coming up. I said I have the door open for her. I showed her where Ian was. She looked at what I left. I left a sleeping medication that I'd given Ian the night before, hoping he would just pass in his sleep. I have my Paxil up there, plus some medication he had for his mild epilepsy. And she said, did you take more of it than you should have? And I said, no, I took the maximum dosage, and that was that. That was the first thing when she asked me. It was like she understood back in 2004 that might have been a possibility, might have somehow caused something. Now, I didn't think much about it until I was at that secure treatment unit. And there was a forensic nurse that came into me and talked to me. I had some therapists around me, and he went and he copied information and brought it to me. Peter Bregan stuff, Dr. Bregan, Dr. David Healy. He brought me this information, and that's the first time I started to put it together. So we're now talking in the spring of 2005 when my trial was in September. So I started to read this, and when I got back into jail on remand, I talked with my lawyer about this, and I shared this information with him. And when I think about it, he was probably taking a risk as a forensic to bring me this information. And he did. He said, look, I just want to share this with you in confidence. He actually said that to me. But he got me really going around the drug because I thought it was a chemical imbalance. I had a biological mental illness I would never, ever recover from in my life. That's what I thought. And then I started to read this information, which had been out there, sadly, for a long time, but nobody knew about it. Certainly not my doctor, and certainly not me. The Health Canada warning had come out that people can harm themselves or others on this drug back in May 2004. So all these pieces were coming together. So I talked with my lawyer and I said, can we build this into my defense? And he said, David, we could, but there's never been a precedent around this in this country. And he said, even if there was, the worst you could expect is a manslaughter conviction because it fits into the same category as illicit drugs. There is no place in the Criminal Code of Canada for a prescription drug-induced homicide. And I said, well, we'll go with the insanity defense, the not criminally responsible. And both my defense lawyer, who hired an expert, plus the Crown Attorney, you call it a prosecutor in the United States, they hired their experts, and they both agreed that I was suffering from a major depression with psychotic episodes when I took my life. And that's including me being calm and organized and calling 911. And this is the interesting part of the Lindsay Clancy case is the prosecutor's major argument is you can't be psychotic and plan this and be so calm. She's wrong. It's exactly what I did.
Yeah. And so I just want to clarify that. It sounds like is that your defense team foregoed focusing on a drug-induced homicide defense because there was no precedent, and it was easier to go after essentially not guilty by reason of insanity or something like that, right? That's like, was that just how? That's exactly what it was. Okay, and
yeah, you're right on the
and the
mark.
reason to not. Sorry, I cut you off, David.
No, I said you're right on the mark with that, Dr. Josef. That was the strategy behind my defense.
Do you know this is interesting, and I know you're familiar with David Healy, but did you ever watch the BBC A Prescription for Murder, where he interviews, where he talks about interviewing James Holmes, who was the Aurora mass shooter down in Colorado?
I have. I'm in the film, actually, with my daughter. We're the only people interviewed for the film. And, what's interesting with that, I used to be on social media till that film was released, and this is interesting. It broke up my interview with my daughter, Jillian. And, she stood by my side. She's been in 2 films with me, Prescription for Murder, plus a film called Letters from Generation RX. She's been on a CTV current affairs show with me. And she went and she was on the Dr. Oz show with me. So she has stood right by my side, right through into her mid-20s. She's been quiet for a while. What was interesting is they broke up my interview and they put it online on YouTube. BBC did. Very quickly, it had over 1 million views, 18,000 comments, and the trolls came out. And it was really interesting for me. The Facebook and Twitter, when I started to continue to be active, I could tell I should be in prison. I should have been executed. I'm not sure where all that comes from. So I went off social media, and just a few years ago, I went back on, and it seems like if they are trolls, I have no idea. But every time I posted anything in the discussion group, people would be sharing negative comments. And I never had that before, the BBC piece. I would go on and I would post comments, but nothing as malicious as what I was receiving.
Yeah. And I think, I've seen these comments before, and, with these types of cases. And I think stories like yours and stories like James Holmes, I will go back to that point I was bringing up. I think it makes people feel very uncomfortable, because when you start thinking about, something horrible that's happened, something that's led to the loss of life, people want it to be simple. They want it to be black and white. They want it to be like the person did it, they're responsible. And when you start talking about, there was a drug and, the drugs could have caused it or something like that, they start to say, well, it doesn't matter. And they can get very defensive. They're just like, the person still did it. And it really messes with that's the only thing that I can see that it's disruptive. It's not clean. It's gray. It's messy, because all of a sudden you get into this territory. Well, at what level does a person lose responsibility, right? Is it when they're completely delirious and they can't concentrate or think straight, almost like the defense was suggesting that, we don't want to go after that, because if you could have planned it, then you must be responsible. And there's no neat way to sort of pass that out. This line between, when you are intoxicated and you do something, and it's especially difficult when it comes to medications taken as prescribed, because if this happens when you're intoxicated on meth or you're intoxicated on some drug or alcohol, no one cares. They just go, well, you were sort of willfully intoxicated on something that, that these things can happen on. But it gets different when you're prescribed something and you're never warned about it. So maybe you could comment on that, that I don't know if you've had similar thoughts about how these things, it's so messy. Yeah. Go. Share your thoughts.
I've had to have these thoughts. I mean, realistically, I don't know how I would be in a situation with somebody else. I mean, there's nothing much more heinous than taking the life of your own child. Mm-hmm. So, that's a good starting point. And that's really what I try to do. Now, the other thing in terms of a drug, a prescription drug, I mean, and you as well as anybody, Dr. Josef knows this. I mean, the chemical makeup is not much different than, for a lot of psychiatric drugs than a lot of illicit drugs. So I believe it caused some type of chemical imbalance in my brain that we'll never know how. That whole chemical imbalance theory about what you have what you need an SSRI to correct. This did something to my brain that no one will ever fully understand, including me. Mm-hmm. But it happens to some people in rare cases. Now, in my case, what's really kept me going and probably has helped me to forgive myself, which is very difficult to do, to move forward, is I've had to try to build a bigger purpose in all this. And I think about Ian many times every day. And the bigger purpose is I do have the opportunity, unlike really almost everyone, to be able to speak out publicly. I mean, the people in the United States that have dealt with what I've dealt with are, either incarcerated, institutionalized, or dead. I feel, coming from Canada and looking at the justice system in the U.S. where they're treated differently, I do feel I have a contribution to make, which is why I have been speaking out I broke my silence as a forensic inpatient in a mental health center. And my lawyer said, you might be here for 10 years doing that. We know how pharmaceutical companies have so much influence on the medical system. But I was out, 4 years after my trial with no criminal record. Mm-hmm. My daughter and wife have stood by me. They knew it was the drug. I remember my wife calling them my Paxil eyes. It's like my eyes were big and never closed. It was, this is so hard to understand for anybody, and I doubt for a long time, it's easier to blame the drug than yourself. That's fine. I'm not out to convince people. I'm out just to try to make people a little more conscientious when they're making their decision. That's really why my focus right now is on informed choice. It really is.
Because I bet that, this isn't something that anyone would want to talk about unless there was a higher purpose behind it.
Oh, I had to find that.
Yeah.
With my background, a lot of my background was in communications and, trying to break new ground in the sport area, trying to get coaches to understand that with children, you don't need to emphasize winning as much as you do in professional sports. But a lot of them do. That was really a lot of my work. And so to me, I really had to grab onto something that would help me heal. And, I'll never fully recover from this. There are triggers every day. But if I can help prevent tragedies like ours, I will.
Yeah. I want to take a moment just to go back to James Holmes, because I do think it brings up something that is interesting in these cases. So David Healy was featured in Prescription for Murder, which covers the James Holmes case. And the same thing happened in their trial, where David evaluates James. He looks at, I think he was on Zoloft, maybe it was a different drug, but he was on a medication, prescribed by a psychiatrist. And he starts feeling worse after he's on it. And then thinking that, it's his depression getting worse, the dose gets doubled. And I think within a few weeks after that, he becomes completely manic and delusional. And eventually, I think, he dresses up, I think, as the Joker or something like that, and he goes into the cinema, and I think he may have killed or injured 50 people. It was about as bad as it gets. And so David looks at the medical records. He interviews James, and there's a really iconic photo of James when he's arraigned, and he has bright red hair and his eyes are wide. He's looking about as manic as you could get, completely out of character for him. And the defense decides to not pursue David's defense, saying essentially there is a case here that this was a drug-induced, that he was psychotic because of the medication. And the way I understood it, and maybe you have more background to me, was that it was actually kind of similar to you. There was no precedent. The death penalty was on the table because it was Colorado. And the defense team felt that it was easier to go for not guilty by reason of insanity. They already knew he was going away for the rest of his life. And it was just, let's go for not guilty by reason of insanity. And they did. And he didn't get the death penalty, but he'll be imprisoned for the rest of his life.
Well, and there's a similar case, and I've become very close over many years since 2012 with a woman named Kim Crespi from North Carolina. Her husband David, who was a senior bank executive, no history of any significant mental illness, sprang under 2 5-year-old daughters to Sarah and Samantha, and he took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. And Kim has been fighting ever since, and still is, to try to get him another trial. So he's been doing 2 consecutive life terms. There's a book out, now about it called Medication, Mental Illness, and Murder. It's being released by Amazon by someone who I know from the North Carolina area, a fellow named Ed Jones. And it really covers everything, including Kim's diaries. It's a fascinating read. Our story's built in it, plus my relationship with Kim is in it. And it does compare the Canadian justice with the American justice system. But I really do think in many ways, and maybe this is more in the United States than Canada, because of just one example of direct-to-consumer advertising. The pharmaceutical industry seems to have so much dominant influence on the medical system that people are afraid of precedents. This may sound ridiculous, but Andy Vickery, a Texas lawyer who I've known over the years, and who was the one that encouraged me to file a lawsuit against GlaxoSmithKline, which I did in 2011. It was dismissed 10 years later on a statute of limitations argument, which they could have done within the first year or two, but they dragged it on. They like a lot of law firms probably do. And Andy Vickery had a precedent-setting case in 2023 in Boise, Idaho. The Supreme Court of Idaho overturned a judgment, and it was considered to be medical malpractice. With this one woman, she was prescribed without the doctor obtaining informed consent. That was the first legal precedent in the United States in 2023 about how Prozac, one drug, psychiatric drug, can induce. It was an attempted suicide with a gun. And it was settled out of court, 2024. That's the first case. This has been going on for decades. When are things going to change? And I've been doing my little bit to contribute to this by sharing a story. And being hammered, my first interview with Kim Crespi. I was asked with CBS in Charlotte, North Carolina, what do you say to people that say you got away with murder? My response was, I didn't get away with murder. GlaxoSmithKline got away with murder, and they're still getting away with murder. Now, that was cut from the actual broadcast and Night This Story, but they kept it online for a decade, that raw footage. So there's some big issues that have never really been addressed. And, Dr. Josef, based on your background, you've been exposed to a lot of this inside the system. Now, I'm not saying you've been exposed to a lot of, we know the pharmaceutical industry has been penalized an awful lot for fraud and other criminal activities, but you've had with your background around clinical research, drug safety within the industry. These interviews must have fascinated to you when you talk with people who are by these drugs.
They are, and I suspect these problems are a lot more widespread than people suspect. And anytime you talk about the whole school shooting and psychiatric drug thing, it's sort of dismissed as if this is just a right-wing conspiracy theory to distract away from the real issue, which is access to guns. That's sort of how it's couched. There's no way the drugs could do this. It's an access to gun problem, and it's a mental illness issue. But the more I've looked into this, and I know your story, and I know stories like yours and James Holmes's and now Kim Crespi's, and the woman in Massachusetts that you mentioned. I think it's happening a lot more than people realize. For instance, there was the woman in the woman in Wyoming who killed her 4 children. I think it was a month ago, something like that. She killed 4 children, and all it says in the newspaper article is that she was suffering from postpartum depression. It doesn't mention medications or anything like that. And there's and you have to think, is someone going to look at the possible role for a drug-induced intoxication? Because you have to think about, what happens to someone what must be going on for something so tragic to happen. And there's been articles out there that dismiss this relationship between drugs and potential violence. And the media will take a line from the conclusion that says something like, there is no evidence that says that these medications can lead to things like homicide. And then I look at them, and it's a study. It's done by someone who's FOIA'd the FBI records for the people who have looked into this, and they've tried to get psychiatrist reports, and a few things happen. One, the person is dead, so no one can interview them. The family doesn't want to talk. The information that they get is redacted. They don't get access to the psychiatry records. Right. Yeah. And people are simply not, the impression I get is people are simply not asking these questions. And at a certain point, I think we need to have, and I think we're far away from this. I mean, if events like these happen, I mean, it has to trigger a forensic assessment by the coroner to at least consider the possibility of drugs as a matter of public health. I don't think this happens, because I think these tragedies happen and people want to lynch someone. If people have died, they want it to be black and white, and they want to get rid of someone. I also think the families have the mob coming after them as well, and they probably don't want to say, hey, potentially was drug induced, but it's just a huge area. I think that we're not looking at as a society that's leading to tragedies.
It's interesting. And so with my civil lawsuit, I filed my civil lawsuit on my own. I couldn't find a lawyer. Mm-hmm. Obviously very difficult in my situation. So I filed it, and I got a call from the law firm representing GlaxoSmithKline within a few days of me submitting what we call a statement of claim in Canada, just not a complaint, which I think is what you call it, a complaint in the United States, saying, mm-hmm. You know what, first thing, the statute of limitations is an issue. I said, it's fine. I filed it 7 years after I took Ian's life. I said, we'll deal with that, I guess. And if you lose, we'll come after all your assets. So that's fine. You can have my 1998 Hyundai Accent. I mean, outside of losing Ian, we've lost all of our assets. Mm-hmm. So interestingly enough, it was, not until like 6 years later to file the motion to get my lawsuit dismissed after, I went through 2 examinations for discovery. My daughter went through 1. My wife went through 1. They literally just dragged it on. And in many ways, I thought they tried to wear us down. But their message during all of this was there's no scientific evidence that Paxil causes homicide. Now, when I look at this, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, because you know much more about this than I do. When they talk about scientific evidence, they're referring to clinical trials. So mm-hmm. if they have an 8-week double-blind randomized controlled trial, and they've fraudulently concealed data, like they did apparently for suicide and possibly homicide, emotional ability, whatever they want to call it. If that's a scientific evidence that is their basis for their statements, how valid is that? Because when there's a strong correlation, it's only anecdotal. And that's the argument. Mm-hmm. There is a correlation, but there's no causation. But if causation is fraudulent, what do we really know about the drugs we're taking? Very little sometimes, and that's the part to me that is part of my messaging now. If there's scientific evidence is based on fraud and concealing negative clinical trial data, then we don't know as much as we need to know to make informed choices about prescription drug use.
And I'll add some texture to that, because you're absolutely right. We've had like the Riot group who go and they redeem sort of trials when they've seemed to be fraudulent, and they did study 329, which was the antidepressant study in children and adolescents, and it was filled with fraud. Suicides being hidden under different terms like agitation. The whole causality method in a placebo-controlled trial is to look at the number of events on placebo versus drug. And the drug company had taken essentially events that had happened on drug and put them in the placebo arm. And so there's so much funny business going on that you don't see. But the other thing that I saw, David, behind the scenes, and I worked in drug safety in pharmaceutical companies, and I also did this at the FDA, reviewing multiple drugs, and I would talk to my colleagues. A lot of the times, if something happened like this, they wouldn't even look into it. They would say, oh, someone had a suicide attempt. Now, you would think, being a federal agency or a drug company, that this would trigger a person to, let's call their family and let's see if there was any hint that a drug, this was a drug-induced side effect. But as soon as they hear that, they go, well, there's no way to differentiate it from the underlying illness, and they go, not causally related, due to schizophrenia or something like that. It's really, really sloppy. So even the post-marketing safety detection for these events when they come in, it's just speaking from my own experience and what I've seen with my colleagues, it's not good. And it's
what is the concern? Is the concern about opening up a Pandora's box around these issues? Is the concern about trying to make sure they have a good relationship with the pharmaceutical industry? I mean, this is where I don't really understand much of this. Setting precedents. Andy Vickery, lawyer from Texas, out breaking ground on his own. He'll see a case and he'll align himself with a lawyer from that area. And Andy's been tremendous, in terms of, Cheyenne, Wyoming, many, many years ago was one of the first cases. Donald Snell, shot his wife, daughter, granddaughter, and then himself, and there was
I'm glad you brought that one up, because there was SmithKline, I think it was SmithKline Beecham at the moment, but that became GSK, which is essentially the manufacturer of Paxil. Yeah. And so, we had Don Shell, the grandfather. I think he killed his wife and then his daughter and then their granddaughter, and the surviving son-in-law, Tobin, maybe Tim Tobin, I think had, they sued SmithKline Beecham for failure to warn, and I think it was failure to warn, and they won. And so a jury said, yes, this was drug induced.
Yeah, and David Healy was the expert witness. But after that, and I've talked with Andy, after that things go quiet. I think law firms will pick up clients, and I think pharmaceutical companies are smart. They settle out of court. Keeps it out of the news. They don't want to get to a jury. So we haven't heard about much else, but that precedent goes back, I'm not sure, it was in 1998. It goes back a lot of years. And, we haven't seen much since until 2003, another precedent about medical malpractice. And that went against the state of Idaho.
That's
plus
incredible.
the physician's assistant. And they were successful, I think, first at the Supreme Court level. It got sent back to the district court. And I think they were successful at settling out of court. But, we'll never know those details.
Now, did the person serve time, and was that were they was this civil or because this was
civil.
I'm trying to. Yeah, this was civil.
This was
okay.
Civil. When I get back, this is to me.
Yeah.
If this could ever happen.
Yeah.
In our justice system in the United States, I really feel strongly, that if the family for Lindsay Clancy filed a civil lawsuit about medical malpractice in Massachusetts, and a jury provided us a judgment in favor of Lindsay Clancy, I really feel that the prosecutor in this criminal case should withdraw the charges. And the money that was used in settlement or through a jury in Massachusetts should be used to care for her as a paraplegic for the rest of her life, because she's going to need that. But I really feel they should withdraw the charges. I really felt that the civil case should go before the criminal case. Now, you often hear the argument that, the standard for civil case is lower than a criminal case. But as soon as I heard the prosecutor say, you can't be psychotic and calmly plan and take the life of your children, I became quite engaged in that tragic story out of Massachusetts, because you can, and a lot of people have. I'm just one that I have whether you call it a fortunate or unfortunate opportunity, I can talk about it.
So let's shift gears for a moment. So I think it would seem, like you said, you got asked that question, how does it feel to get away with murder? I think it's really hard for people to understand how something that like this could happen, and that you would walk away. How did this happen? Like what was it like going through trial and the judge because that is something that makes you very unique. I can't think of anyone else who this has happened to where they haven't ended up in prison, essentially. So what happened in the trial? What happened with the judge to get a judgment like that?
Well, the forensic psychiatrist that my lawyer hired took me through an assessment. Yeah. And they knew all about my behavior. They knew that I planned this trip. I had bought an over-the-counter medication the week of, put it into a vial. I mean, they knew all of this. So this was planned. I planned the trip. And his diagnosis was that I was suffering from major depression with psychotic episodes. So he shared that information with the crown attorney or with the prosecutor, who brought his own expert, who agreed with my criminal defense lawyer's expert. So there was a joint resolution. So I knew I was going into a 3-day trial knowing that I was going to be found not criminally responsible. We brought in a couple of witnesses. It was the very first time that the forensic psychiatrist who did my report was not cross-examined. Not one question from the crown attorney. To me, this was a very obvious case of what they would have diagnosed as major depressive psychotic episodes. The drug didn't play into it, which in my case, I think was probably very good in not muddying the waters. I think it was a very clean case. I had no history of mental illness. I had a good career. I mean, I've been off all psychiatric drugs since 2010, and I've dealt with more day-to-day stress than I've ever dealt with, over the last, 15 years, far more, with a tremendous amount of distress that I certainly have in a different perspective now. And I've had to work through it, without taking any type of psychiatric drug, and many other losses, but I think because it was a joint resolution, I was very fortunate. I got a crown attorney that agreed with my defense lawyer based on their expert reports. And those expert reports were quite thorough. I spent a lot of time with both forensic psychiatrists, both my defense hired plus who the crown hired.
So that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, another thing that comes to my mind, David, is I could easily see something like this blowing a family apart, that a spouse would not want to support the husband, the surviving child would not want to support the father. What was that like? After this happened, did they believe you from the beginning? Did it take some time? What was that? How did that play out?
Well, both my wife and daughter, the Paxil part when it was brought into it, there was, well, my thought was Paxil before I even started to really get my head around this. She just knew that I was different on the drug. I was abrupt, as I talked earlier, but, people who are on these drugs, it's not always a physical violence. It can just be an abruptness. And my wife saw I was totally different with these big eyes on Paxil. She felt it was a drug right away. And so did my daughter. She noticed a change in my behavior. Up until that point, I had been a loving father, tremendous support for both of my children, Ian and Jillian. As I thought, I would try my best as a spouse. We had a really wonderful home. It was a playground for children. Our backyard had a full half pipe in it, a trampoline for the kids, a tetherball, climbing wall. We had basket. I was working in that whole sport and physical activity area. Our backyard was all around developing fundamental motor skills and making sure the neighborhood children had fun. So it was so obvious that something snapped. And I don't think they really thought too much about it being some sort of biological condition. My wife right away felt it was a drug. And ironically, she went to the doctor after everything for grief, and her doctor wanted to prescribe her Paxil. And she just looked at her and said, no, thanks. My wife is a runner. She's dealt with this through a lot of physical activity. And, my daughter too, both of them. I would say sport in many ways saved our family, based on their, dealing with it through physical activity and sport. And certainly for me, I'm not as physically active, but gosh, a lot of the skills I learned as a high performance athlete at university, a lot of the mental skills I developed, I had to use just to survive.
Did you ever hear from the doctor who prescribed the medication after all of this came out?
No, I've never heard from the doctor. I know GlaxoSmithKline, the law firm representing him in the civil case, got his notes, and I've never approached the doctor. And I think he's very common of most doctors, to be quite honest. And I'll say most, quite confidently. I may be different now, but we didn't talk about the side effects. He prescribed the drug, didn't monitor me. I think that's still going on in a lot of cases. I hear about that quite often from other families who have been prescribed these drugs, and the ages seem to be getting younger. The doctor doesn't talk certainly about suicidal ideation, even with the black box warning. Oh, the child might not take the drug. Well, that's right. Maybe they should be looking for an alternative.
Yeah. David, firstly, thank you so much for sharing this story and speaking out about what is surely the darkest moment in your life. I don't have further questions at this time, so I'd like to turn it over to you. What haven't we covered that you think might be interesting for my audience to learn about or hear before we wrap up?
Well, first of all, Dr. Josef, I appreciate the opportunity to, and I've talked with you about different things that I've talked about with any other interview that I've had, and I broke my silence in 2006. And I'll cover this off. Ever since Andrea Yates, who is in a psychiatric hospital in Texas, she drowned her 5 children in a bathtub. And, in 2006, she had her convictions of murder overturned. She became successful in an insanity defense, covered by newspapers right around the United States. Not one mentioned that she was on twice the recommended maximum dosage of Effexor when she took the life of her young children, had been on just for a few weeks. She's still in a psychiatric hospital, is never asked to get out. Because I've been reaching out to her because she was my motivation to break my silence. So I've been breaking my silence, but I think I've got it after 20 years almost. I think the real fundamental issue is around it, and I've really started to try to understand this. And that's why I've sort of developing a talk called Demand Informed Consent. That may seem a bit extreme. It's your legal right. But if doctors have a legal requirement to obtain informed consent, that includes not only talking about the risks and benefits of the drug, but also alternatives and allowing questions. And that's not happening very much. In fact, when I talk to people, they have no idea what informed consent is. But I think people should be starting to request that, to ask for that. And that's really where my focus is going to be, probably until I stop advocating around drug safety. I really think we need to start asking, because we have a legal right to that. We do have a right to choice. And what I'm learning, and this is interesting, and I hope it is for you viewers, if you're an audience with the pharmaceutical influence on medical systems, and I know you're from Australia, I don't know what it's like there in terms of medical school, but it seems like increasingly doctors through their training are being educated less and less about alternatives to these drugs. And if that's the case, then I don't even think doctors have the knowledge to be able to obtain informed consent. And to me, that becomes a real big societal issue. And you know what? I'll tell you, that's where I'm going to be focusing my energy probably for, I don't know, probably not the next 20 years, but I'm going to continue to build this in my career. And the alternative I'm going to focus on is going to be sports coaches. And the reason I'm targeting sports coaches is because I believe they're a sleeping giant in healthcare. I mean, when you think about it, if sport was free for children, they could go into a program and develop some fundamental motor skills. Because at a young age, your whole feeling of self-worth, a lot of it is around watching somebody else, a kid. That kid can kick the ball better than me. I mean, they don't care about how much money they're making or their career. It really is around their physical abilities. Good coaches can do that. They can give these kids fundamentals that can help them for life. Plus, there's no reason why they can't introduce fundamental breathing skills to kids as young as 5, 6 years of age. You're feeling anxious, performance anxiety. I talked to a mother in Sacramento. A doctor wanted to prescribe Prozac to her 5-year-old son because he was getting really nervous before batting in T-ball. I said, why don't you buy a T-ball kit, put it in your backyard, and let the child just hit it over and over and over until he started to feel more self-conscious. She said, I never even thought about that. Go to the doctor and get a drug. So I guess what I'm saying, there's a lot of work to do. Sport is my example because I know sport. It's going to make people feel uncomfortable because I'm coming back to talking about children in sport after taking the life of my 11-year-old son. I mean, that's hard on me, and it's going to be very awkward on a lot of my former colleagues. I expect that to happen. But it's where I'm going. I'm trying to merge my previous career with my current drug safety advocacy, and at least position something as an alternative to these very powerful drugs that we know very little about.
You raise a good, something that you said was really stuck out to me because I know someone else who's going after the informed consent. It's a gentleman called Derek Blumke, who is a veteran and who had a horrific, I think it was a Zoloft withdrawal injury, a protracted withdrawal injury. But he also represents veterans who have had drug-induced suicides. And one of his main asks, because he's very active in the advocacy, is for something called signatory informed consent. So people have to sign off on a piece of paper, when they're prescribed in the VA, acknowledging the risks. Now, the interesting thing with psychiatric drug side effects is people don't recognize when they're happening because if something is affecting the brain, the ability to be introspective and understand that this thing is happening is diminished. I mean, you could walk around manic and grandiose and have no idea that something's wrong because the organ that's generating those perceptions is unwell. And so if we were going to do signatory informed consent for these drugs, along with the discussing the risks and the alternatives, it would have to involve another person being there as well. Watch this person if you see their behavior worsening, yeah.
Oh, Dr. Josef, when I was in my psychotic episode, I had no idea that I was delusional. So, and my wife really didn't understand any of this. So I agree with you. On my website, knowyourdrugs.org, I've got a consent section, which actually has a medication form for consent, just as an example right on it. And if people do sign off, then I agree with it. You have to be monitored, and it's not going to be by doctors. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen for people to know what to look for. And I've talked to delusional people, and I'll tell you how it's worked for me, is I have to get inside their delusions just to find out how delusional they really are. So I almost embellish and work with the delusion. And because I have spent some time providing some peer support, and I've been with one family, and I literally was just talking to, this was a young person. And right away I walked away saying, your son's delusional. There's no question about it. Mm-hmm. These thoughts are irrational. They don't make any sense I'm no doctor. So this is just based on my perception. I mean, what your next step is your next step. So they went back to the doctor and they actually helped the child wean off the drugs. That's just one example. I periodically, people will find me and I feel obligated to, try to prevent tragedies like ours. I really do.
Well, David, thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for your bravery in speaking up, and what you are doing is making a difference. And if this is what you're doing for the rest of your career, God, psychiatric people all over the world need to hear your message. So thank you so much for coming on and speaking with me and my audience.
I really appreciate this, and I'm just one piece of it. I share the story. We need more people doing the type of work you're doing, Dr. Josef.
If you're interested in learning more about how antidepressants can lead to violence and homicide, you're not going to want to miss this interview that I did with David Healy.